In my last video, I described the process of finishing my first novel and moving on to the second that I'm currently working on. But I decided to, this time around, go forward with a very different process. I'm currently just in the planning stages of this novel, but this new way that I've found to do so is for me, it works very well, and this is by far the most efficient and effective planning stage I've ever had. It's gone from weeks spent planning and still not being able to think of anything to days. To be fair, this is the summer, so I've been spending like 4 hours every day, something like that, more some days planning this novel. Today I spent, I think something like 4, maybe more, planning. But it's moved by at an incredible pace, and probably within another week I'll be done planning it, and then I'll have time over the rest of the summer to basically bang out the whole thing. So, first, let me explain what this whole novel is about. And I can't give you that much information because this might get published. It has a much better chance than my first novel. First of all, because the plot is a lot better done. The plot in the first novel, it's not a bad idea that I have. It's not a bad concept. But I feel the conflict in the first one could be better done, which is something I'll take a look at, after I finish this novel. Then I'm going to go back and with a fresh set of eyes, look at the first novel and do a humongous round of edits on that one, because it could really use it, I feel like. And get as many people to read it and give me their views as possible. But I'm getting off track. Anyways, essentially, without giving many spoilers, to give you sort of the thumbnail sketch you'd find on the back of any commercial novel, for this one, essentially, there's a guy. His name's Phil. He follows the rules of life. He's a university professor, and he has schedules, he has rules. He follows all the rules. Everything his parents told him to follow. And he's basically a romance novel male lead. Because, in romance novels, it's always, the guy follows all the rules. He's so constricted. He's so disciplined. And that's what makes him, but he's like intense beneath. So that's what makes him sexy. But then the lady comes in and she destroys all his schedules and destroys all his discipline. He's that guy. And he's married, but she didn't actually destroy all his schedules because she's not a brainless bimbo. So, he's like that. Then he gets kidnapped by a bunch of gang guys because he teaches forensics. He used to do forensics about arson cases on the police force in the city he's in, which is not named yet. I might decide on a city later or just call it City. Just blank City. So they want his help covering up a murder, and he lights the whole place on fire and escapes. And then they force him into doing things for them. And he finds that when they force him to break the rules, do dangerous things, he actually enjoys it more than it thought he would, and that creates a lot of internal conflict. Basically, the whole hook of this novel is this guy finds a lot of security in following the rules, and it scares him a ton when he's forced to break them. But there's that little bit of him that kind of likes it, and that scares him even more. So, a big question is, why did I jump from a fantasy novel to a thriller novel? Hay varias razones. Primero, I want to know if I'm better at thriller or at fantasy/sci-fi. Because I've had plenty of ideas for fantasy, for sci-fi. I've written plenty over the years, short stories, longer stories, Although I've written actually more thriller short stories. And I just have a lot of ideas for that, and I read a lot of that. But I also read a lot of thriller. I can enjoy a lot of things as long as it's not romance. Pretty much if it's anything but romance, I can like it. Even if it's romance, I like it for the comedy because it's so melodramatic, it's just hilarious. But I've only finished a fantasy novel. I have yet to ever write a thriller novel, and I have a style that works for modern fantasy, but may work better for thriller. I write slightly shorter works than that. My first novel is 90,000 words, so it's not a small novel, but I trend towards not over 100,000 words, definitely. And I have a very sort of punchy, sparse, and not very sentimental kind of style. So that might work better for thrillers, so I'm just trying to test that out. As well, easier to finish a thriller more quickly. I just find that it's easy. You don't have to explain as much with thrillers because you're not building a whole world, which also means that the planning isn't as difficult because you can just rely on the rules of the real world. You don't need to make an entire new world for your characters to live in. And it can be a little bit shorter. It can't be like tiny. I'm aiming for above 80,000 words, but like a little shorter at least. And also, I just love this idea that I have. There's more details than what I've shared with you, which makes me really like this idea. There's stuff that I just can't share with you right now if you're ever going to read it, which hopefully all of you will. You will, right? But I just love this idea. But the biggest thing I wanted to talk about today is the change that I've gone through beginning to plan this new novel. So before, whenever I would plan novels, and I've planned out a lot more novels than I have written. I've written one novel, I've started like 50, and I've planned like 500. I have so many just brain dump Google Doc files of just, I'm super inspired, I have this idea, I just vomit like pages and pages into this Google Docs, rambling about it. Completely disorganized, completely stream of consciousness. If you saw the outline and the scene list that I did for Stormhawk, damn, I tried so hard to be organized. Damn, did that not work. And I changed the plot in my head. I just thought up the new ideas in my head, like halfway through, and completely went back and changed very much of the things that came before, and changed everything that came after, and just changed a humongous amount of the novel, changed its whole direction. And that meant that I just ignored pretty much everything that was in my outline, and I just used what was in my head. So when it came to planning, I was not as organized as I generally am with everything in my life. I'm a compulsively organized kind of weirdo, but with my outlines, wasn't quite the case. So what happened with this thing, though, is instead of just barfing out the idea and then thinking, okay, what scene is going to come next? And I would just sit there and think, well, what scene does anything cool? And I ended up not using a lot of the scenes that I wrote. And in earlier stories, especially more recent ones that I was planning, I would come up with a lot of scenes, like a lot of the bigger scenes, and I know what the general trend and theme of my novel is going to be, but I just sort of sat there and looked at the screen. And when I was inspired to plan, because I get my biggest moments of inspiration planning the novel, not while actually writing it, while planning it. And I just have amazing scene ideas, just out of the blue. But when I didn't have that, I just stare at the outline and just keep staring at it and do nothing. and I couldn't really force inspiration, because you can't force inspiration, but I couldn't come up with new scene ideas unless I was inspired, which is a huge flaw for a writer. You need to be able to write when you're not inspired. You need to be able to come up with ideas for what to write when you're not inspired. This time around, though, I realized, and this probably won't work for every novel that I write. This probably doesn't work for most novels, to be honest. But I realized that this is a novel that moves very progressively. There's a change in the character. There's changes in other things, changes in various facets of his life, in other people's lives, that move kind of gradually. And I realized that for so many different things, I had in mind a start point and an end point, and certain twisty or surprising bumps in between. And I essentially started connecting the dots. And I set up lists of progressions. The progression of Phil from rule follower to enjoying breaking the rules, but also big twist at the end, kind of comes back to what he was, but not really. It's complicated. And in other areas, there's the villain, his progression in his plans. I realized that while I don't have the details down yet, I can just sort of fill in what each major beat does and what it does to the characters, even if I don't know exactly what's going to happen for each beat. That'll fill in later, probably when I write it, because the itty-bitty details of what's happening are important. If you don't have that, you can't have your novel. But what's more important is the overall trend and the overall effect, the bones of the story rather than the guts. To borrow a term kind of from anatomy, like I'm borrowing it from housing description. You know, they talk about a house having, like, gutting a house and seeing if it has good bones. That's more the context I'm using it in, but that's referring to anatomy, so I'm using a double metaphor here. But essentially, it's kind of difficult to explain. But, you know, you have start point, you have end point. And just to show it visually, start point's up here, end point's down here. You can sort of build a staircase. Each step gradually moves you toward the end point with bump, you know, the surprising moments that had already come to me when I was inspired in between. And this makes it much easier to come up with scenes because I can almost do it mechanically. Because now I know what I want each scene to do. This scene fits in right here in this sequence that leads to this. And most of the scenes fulfill a step, what I call a note. That's just the term I use when I'm writing it in my scene list. But like a step along that staircase toward the end, and I know I can decide which steps I want to take, how big they're going to be, what each step is going to signify, what makes it different from the other steps. That kind of structure, where everything's kind of the same in, like, very, very boiled down basic concept, limits things enough to allow me to be creative with it and make each scene unique, but it doesn't have to be a completely different thing from every other scene, even if it's showing something that's not seen in any other scene in the book. Like, not exactly like that. I know exactly where it fits in and exactly what it's going to show and exactly what, like, it makes it easier to find which other scenes it fits in with. Like, which other things it happens at a similar time as, and which things it influences and leads to. Here I have open my scene list plus objectives, which is essentially the things I want to accomplish over the course of the story. So here I have the template outlining what a progression is. Here's the progression number. You know, I list all of the progressions by numbers. A progression would be like his decline in his professional life, his overall greater, like, overarching decline from rules follower to rules breaker. Here's the title, for example, professional/teaching decline, because remember, he's a professor. The characters affected is where I essentially just list all of the characters that are overall quite relevant to this particular progression from some point A to some point B. The purpose/goals, why am I doing this progression? You know, like, what does this show about the characters? What conflict does this create? And what do I want to do in this progression to do those things? The notes hit / scene to scene. This is just the essentially listing the steps in the progression that take you from point A to point B, that that like allow you to know, like, here's where you're beginning, here's where, and I know where I'm ending, and I just space it out such that it happens gradually but believably, such that each time it's a little slip, and then at the end you can look back and see how far you've fallen. And ties in with other progressions. This is just where you list the other progressions that that this particular progression sort of goes hand in hand with. And for example, we can look up here. This is progression number 6. Title: The Handler. The guy, essentially the guy from the gang who's dealing with Phil, making him do things, progresses towards plans. Because he has plans of his own. I'm not telling you what those plans are, but those are what but that's what it is. He has plans. For example, you look at the second scene here. This is also the first scene in the first progression. Like, it essentially happens at the same time. It essentially is a different look at those events, because there are multiple events involved in each of these steps along each progression, basically looking at it through the lens of that particular progression. So essentially, this method of organizing my novel has allowed me to organize it way faster, way more efficiently, way more organized overall, instead of just ideas barfed onto a page that I have to go through the whole way, just to find the few, like very few, that I actually want to use. Well, there are a few miscellaneous ideas listed earlier on that I didn't show you, but each scene just fits so readily into its slot in each progression that I already know what's usable, what's not, and it's so much easier to come up with each scene because I already know what I want a scene to do. So now I just need to come up with what scene would accomplish that. I have no idea if this method of organizing a novel works for others, but if anybody would like me to, I can detail it further in a future video. But that's all I've got for today. I know I've generally done this section with Banjo in the past, but today I'm too lazy to get it out, so I figured I'd just do it with my voice and see if it actually works this time, because up till now it hasn't. Do not forget to like, subscribe, comment, and ring that notification bell if you would like more weekly writing advice.